A restless dog kept barking at the door of a seemingly abandoned house, refusing to budge. When its curious owner finally stepped inside, he let out a scream no one saw coming. It began as just another walk around a quiet suburban block, the evening sun dipping behind rooftops. Nick strolling with his spirited dog, Lilo felt the day's tension ease with each step. But then Lilo froze by the crumbling fence of a house no one lived in anymore, an old place rumored to be vacant for years. No matter Nick's coaxing, Lilo wouldn't leave. Instead, she barked at the sagging front porch, ears pinned forward and fur standing on end. Nick tugged the leash gently, but Lilo resisted, letting out urgent, high-pitched yaps that echoed through the still air. Neighbors had whispered tales about that house, how its owners disappeared mysteriously, how distant relatives never sold the place. Some claimed it was haunted by unsettled spirits. Nick never believed such gossip, but Lilo's frantic barks gave him pause. She seemed convinced something inside required attention, as if her senses picked up on a presence no one else perceived. Cars passed by, drivers glancing at the spectacle of a dog fixated on a rundown property. Nick felt an uneasy tingle. He considered turning back, ignoring the dog's alarm. Yet Lilo's unwavering stance made him hesitate. Perhaps an injured animal lay inside, or a stray dog needing help. He decided to see what, if anything, lurked behind the battered door. Stepping onto the creaking porch, Nick noticed a pungent, musty odor drifting through a broken window. Lilo's barks intensified, each one echoing a silent plea. "Check now, hurry." With a half shudder, Nick tried the door, surprisingly unlocked. Shad groaned on rusted hinges as he pushed it open. Darkness swallowed his first step, the stale air hitting his nostrils like a warning. Lilo barked again, more frantic. Summoning courage, Nick took a few steps in, phone flashlight cutting through heavy shadows. Immediately, he spotted signs of neglect, toppled furniture, littered papers, an eerie hush. But then something else caught his eye, an unsettling shape at the far corner, half hidden by debris. When his light finally illuminated the form, Nick's scream tore through the gloom. In that single, heart-stopping instant, he understood why Lilo wouldn't stop barking at this old house. The dog had sensed a horrifying secret left to rot. Now Nick stood at the threshold of a discovery that would unravel grim truths about a place everyone considered simply abandoned. His heart pounded, and Lilo whined softly by his ankles. Together, they'd walked into something far more disturbing than any haunted rumor. The moment Nick stepped inside that decrepit house, a foul odor hit him like a punch. It wasn't just the stench of mold or dust, but something deeper, more unsettling, a stagnant reek that hovered in the stale air. Lilo, his usually brave dog, whimpered at his feet, still barking intermittently at whatever lay hidden in the gloomy interior. Nick's pulse throbbed in his ears as he aimed the narrow beam of his phone's flashlight across the front room, revealing debris and time-stained wallpaper peeling in long curls. He blinked hard, trying to steady his nerves. He'd never known Lilo to act like this, and her agitation confirmed something was terribly off. "Easy, girl," he whispered, reaching down to calm her, though his own heart hammered in his chest. The faint echo of his voice bounced off walls that hadn't heard a human presence in ages. He swallowed, resisting the urge to flee. Ever since Lilo refused to budge from that warped front porch, an uneasy prickling had crawled over his skin. Now wading into darkness, he dreaded what he might find, yet a compulsion fueled by Lilo's urgency pushed him to press on. One slow step after another, Nick advanced. He paused by a toppled bookshelf that had scattered dusty novels across the floor. A thick layer of grime coated everything, and his shoes stuck slightly to an unknown residue. Lilo sniffed the air, letting out another short bark, as if pointing him onward. The house felt suffocating, each breath thick with rot and a faint chemical tang. A battered sofa slumped in the corner, springs poking through faded cushions. Nick's flashlight beam flicked over it, revealing stains he preferred not to identify. "Hello?" he called, though his voice cracked, uncertain if he wanted an answer. Silence answered him, broken only by Lilo's nails clicking on warped floorboards. Dust particles danced in his flashlight's beam, swirling in the oppressive stillness. He remembered how neighbors spun eerie tales about this place, talk of strange noises at odd hours, glimpses of shadows through broken windows. No one believed them wholeheartedly. It was easier to dismiss the stories as the product of bored imaginations. But now Nick couldn't shake the feeling that something dreadful had happened here. The air seemed saturated with sorrow, or maybe malevolence. Lilo barked again, spinning toward a hallway leading deeper into the house. Nick followed her gaze, noticing a half-closed door at the corridor's end. Dark, thick grime coated the handle. "Is that what you want me to see?" he murmured to his dog. She responded with a low growl, then barked again, stepping forward, trembling with both courage and fear. Nick's stomach twisted. He wanted to bolt out the front door and call the authorities. But what if a living creature needed urgent help in here? He took a breath. If the worst had already happened, maybe he could at least uncover the truth. Shoring up his courage, he advanced down the hallway. The walls were covered in dingy floral paper, shredded in places, revealing cracked plaster beneath. A tangle of cobwebs dangled from the ceiling, brushing his hair as he passed. Lilo crept alongside, tail low, her occasional whimpers sending shivers down Nick's spine. The further they went, the stronger the vile smell grew, an acrid mixture of rot, garbage, and something almost chemical. His eyes watered. What on earth happened in this place? He reached the door at the end of the hall, resting a hand on the doorknob. It felt cold and slightly moist, as though moisture from the house's decay had seeped in. Lilo barked again, more insistent, pawing at the door. "Okay, okay," Nick muttered, heart hammering in his ears. Slowly, he pushed the door open. A wave of stench rushed out, intensifying to a level that made him gag. He covered his mouth, stepping back, but Lilo whined, pressing forward. Steeling himself, Nick shone his flashlight in. The room beyond appeared to be a small bedroom once. An unmade mattress in the corner, a toppled lamp, walls riddled with dark smears. Something was on the floor, hunched and shapeless, near the far wall. His heart pounded faster as he took a cautious step, the flashlight beam quivering over the form. Lilo barked frantically, and he forced himself to look closer. That's when he realized it was no mere pile of trash or clothing. It was a shape with an unmistakable outline of limbs, twisted at unnatural angles. Nick's breath caught. His scream, sharp and raw, echoed in the small space. He staggered back, nearly tripping. The phone flashlight illuminated what looked like a human figure, skeletal remains wrapped in tattered cloth, flesh long decayed. Dull, empty eye sockets stared upward, a silent witness to something unspeakable. Lilo barked, stepping cautiously forward. Nick yanked her leash. "No," he gasped. He could hardly breathe, the rancid odor mingling with waves of horror. This had to be the occupant of the house, someone who died and was never discovered. How could no one have known, or had someone hidden the body? A million questions assailed him. Swallowing nausea, he forced his eyes to remain on the scene. The remains seemed haphazardly left near the wall, as though whoever died, or was placed here, had no dignity in their final moments. Nick struggled to keep calm, adrenaline surging. He needed to call 911. This wasn't just a random house with a curious noise. This was a crime scene or a tragic unknown death. Heart thudding, he fumbled for his phone, nearly dropping it in his panic. Shoving away from the grisly spectacle, Nick stumbled into the hallway, Lilo close behind. His thoughts spiraled. How long had that body lain there? Who was it? Why hadn't anyone reported the smell? Maybe they did, but rumors of a haunted property kept them away. Gagging again from the lingering stench, Nick managed to reach the front door. He burst outside, gulping fresh air. Lilo whined, pressing against his leg, as if to reassure him they'd escaped. Hands shaking, he dialed emergency services, relaying the terrifying discovery. Dispatch asked for the address, urging him to stay on scene until officers arrived. Numb, Nick sank onto the curb, Lilo nuzzling his arm. "Good girl," he whispered, voice quavering. "You knew. You got me to see." The dog licked his cheek, tail wagging gently as if trying to console him. His mind spun with the horrifying images, but a strange sense of relief mingled with it. At least the body would no longer lie there, forgotten. Within minutes, sirens approached, and red and blue lights bathed the street. Neighbors peeked from windows, startled by the commotion around the supposedly empty house. Nick waited, trembling, as the first officers jogged over. He stammered out an explanation, pointing to the open door, tears pricking his eyes. Lilo lay at his feet, silent now, her job done. Whatever grim secret that abandoned house held, it was finally uncovered, thanks to a dog's relentless bark and a man who dared to follow it into the dark. Minutes after Nick made the emergency call, the small suburban street buzzed with flashing lights and curious onlookers. Police vehicles blocked off the area near the abandoned house, and an ambulance stood by, though it was clear no rescue was needed, only a grim investigation. Neighbors shuffled in clusters on the sidewalk, hushed murmurs spreading as they glimpsed uniformed officers trudging in and out of the dilapidated home. Nick sat on a curb with Lilo, his dog leaning into his side as though sensing his lingering shock. An officer approached, a woman with a calm but serious demeanor. She crouched beside Nick. "Sir, I'm Officer Hines. You discovered the remains." Nick nodded numbly, recalling the horrific sight in a fractured wave of nausea and dread. Lilo whimpered softly at the officer's presence. "Yes, Nick swallowed. "My dog kept barking at the porch, so I went in. Then we found that body." He shuddered. I just called 911. Officer Hines offered a sympathetic nod. "I'm sorry you had to see that. Did you notice anything else? Personal items? Signs of foul play?" Nick shook his head. "It was too dark. I just saw—" He gagged slightly, mind returning to the twisted remains. "I had to get out." The officer rested a hand on his shoulder. "You did fine. We have a forensic team en route to examine everything." She eyed Lilo. "Your dog really insisted you check it out." Nick managed a faint nod, pride for Lilo stirring amid horror. At that moment, another officer emerged from the house, radio crackling. "We've got what appears to be skeletal remains, possibly mummified. Hard to estimate time of death. The scene's a mess, trash, old furniture, signs of squatters, but no immediate ID on the body." Officer Hines relayed that update to Nick. He felt numb. Lilo pawed at his knee, urging him to pet her. Gently, he stroked her ears, grateful for her unwavering calm. The police taped off the property, asking Nick to wait for a detective's questioning. Meanwhile, neighbors approached, whispering questions. "Is it true? Her body in there?" Nick could only nod, voice cracking each time he tried to speak. People stared at Lilo, aware now that her barking led to this grim reveal. Nick overheard hushed theories. Maybe it was a missing owner, or a victim of crime. Some recalled old rumors about the house's last occupant disappearing without a trace. 30 minutes later, a detective named Rosales arrived in a plain sedan, stepping out with a purposeful stride. She spoke briefly with the forensic team, then approached Nick. "I'm Detective Rosales. Could you walk me through exactly what happened?" Nick steadied himself, recounting Lilo's strange behavior at the fence, her refusal to leave, and how he entered the house out of concern. Detective Rosales took notes methodically, occasionally glancing at the dog. When Nick described the horrifying sight of the remains, she gave a small nod, her expression grim yet professional. "Did you touch anything?" she asked. Nick shook his head. "No, just shined my phone's flashlight around." She jotted that down, then asked if he recognized anything about the scene, an odor, unusual items. Nick mentioned the intense stench and some dark smears on the walls, though he wasn't sure if they were stains or something else. The detective sighed, rubbing her temple. "We'll see what forensics says. This place might have been a hideout or leftover from something years ago. Thank you for alerting us." As they spoke, a coroner's van pulled up, the team prepping to enter with a gurney and evidence bags. Nick tried not to watch them, the reality of retrieving the body making his stomach twist. Lilo let out a low whine, tail drooping. Detective Rosales patted the dog gently. "She's a good girl, leading you here. Without that, who knows how long that poor soul would have stayed undiscovered." Nick's mind reeled with implications. Someone died alone in that house, unmissed for who knew how many months or years. The rumors of a haunted property might have simply been the byproduct of neglect and something far more tragic inside. He found himself murmuring to Lilo, "You did the right thing, girl." She gazed back with those earnest brown eyes, as if she, too, carried the sorrow of what they found. After giving his statement, Nick was finally allowed to leave, Lilo trotting at his side. He noticed a couple of neighbors whispering as he passed, some offering hushed thanks that he'd followed his dog's instincts, others staring with morbid curiosity. He drove home in silence, Lilo perched in the passenger seat, her muzzle resting on his arm as though sensing he needed comfort. The house's macabre secret weighed on his heart like a lead weight. He wondered how he'd sleep that night, images of the remains flashing every time he closed his eyes. Sure enough, hours later, Nick tossed in bed, haunted by nightmares of dark rooms and silent screams. Lilo, sleeping at his feet, periodically shifted or whimpered, perhaps echoing his distress. When morning light finally streaked his window, he felt relief just to escape the lingering nightmares of that decaying house. After a groggy breakfast, he decided to look up any history about the property. Perhaps if he understood who the victim was, he could quiet the dread swirling in his mind. He found little official info, just confirmation the house belonged to a family who disappeared after falling into financial ruin. No updates ever surfaced. Some rumored they abandoned the city altogether. Nick scoured local news archives, stumbling upon an old article referencing a homeowner's abrupt foreclosure, but nothing indicated violent crime. If this was one of them, how had no one known? Throughout the day, calls and texts bombarded Nick. Friends heard about the discovery through social media or rumor. They asked if he was okay. He mustered tired reassurances, repeatedly giving the short version, "My dog insisted I check. Found a body." "Police are investigating." The monotony of telling the story did little to ease his unresolved horror. By late afternoon, Detective Rosales phoned with a brief update. Forensic experts pegged the time of death as years prior. Foul play was possible, but not confirmed. She asked if Nick recalled any suspicious items, but he repeated his limited recollection. Shadows, toppled furniture, a pungent odor. "We'll keep you posted," the detective concluded. Nick hung up, gazing at Lilo, who dozed beside him on the couch. "We did all we could, huh?" She lifted her head, letting out a quiet yawn. Yet despite the official progress, Nick felt an odd responsibility gnawing at him. We found the body, but do we just move on? The dog's relentless barking suggested something bigger than simply discovering remains. In quiet moments, he replayed how Lilo stood at that door, refusing to budge. Could the dog sense something else, like a lingering presence in that lonely house? Nick shuddered at the thought, telling himself it was nonsense, but the uneasy questions wouldn't let go. He resolved to stay in touch with Detective Rosales, hoping the investigation might reveal a name or story behind those bones. Perhaps then he could find closure, for himself, for Lilo, and most importantly, for whomever died there without a final word. As he patted Lilo's fur, Nick whispered, "We won't forget them." The dog blinked up at him, tail giving a small wag, as though affirming their silent promise. Tomorrow might offer new answers or deepen the mystery, but for now Nick was sure of one thing. Lilo's unyielding bark had exposed a tragedy hidden behind rotten walls, ensuring that forgotten soul wouldn't remain abandoned any longer. Sleep came in fits for Nick that night. Each time he drifted off, images of the decayed figure in the dark house jolted him awake. Lilo, usually a sound sleeper, also stirred, as though picking up on his restlessness. By dawn, Nick decided he couldn't endure another day of tension without some tangible action. After feeding Lilo, he set his mind on returning to the scene, if only to observe any progress or glean some sense of closure. But he hesitated. Police tape likely still cordoned off the property, and he didn't want to interfere. Ultimately, he called Detective Rosales, asking if it was permissible to drop by. Rosales answered in a tired but polite tone. "We're still processing the site. Forensics is nearly done," she explained. "You can come, but don't cross the tape. If you're hoping for new info, I'm afraid we've hit a lot of dead ends." Nick thanked her, deciding he'd at least show face, see if Lilo had any further reaction. If nothing else, he could place flowers or a small token, acknowledging the life lost in anonymity. Walking back to that lonely street felt surreal. The day was bright, the neighborhood calm, an odd contrast to the grim events unfolding behind those warped boards and shattered windows. Lilo trailed behind him, tail slightly lowered, as if remembering the prior visit's horror. When the house came into view, Nick's heart pounded. Yellow police tape fluttered around the perimeter, a single patrol car stationed outside. An officer leaned against the car's hood, acknowledging Nick with a nod of recognition. Nick halted well before the boundary, Lilo sniffing the air. He noticed the front door stood propped open, probably for ventilation. A faint, acrid smell still lingered. The officer spoke. "Detective Rosales is inside. She'll be out in a moment." Nick waited, heart heavy. Lilo let out a low whine, inching closer to the house but not barking this time, more resigned than alarmed. In a few minutes, Rosales emerged, wiping sweat from her brow, latex gloves peeking out from her pocket. "Got your text?" she said, regarding Nick with a sympathetic gaze. "We're nearly done collecting evidence. The coroner took the remains last night." She paused, scanning the vacant yard. "No signs of forced entry or bullet casings. Could be accidental death, an overdose, or a health crisis. Possibly foul plays, but the condition of the body makes it tough." Nick listened, a hollow ache forming at the idea someone died alone here, hidden for so long. Clearing his throat, he asked softly, "Any ID?" Rosales shook her head. "We found a few scraps of mail dated years ago, but no conclusive ID. Might have to check dental records, but that can take time. If we're lucky. An old missing persons file could match." Her tone held resigned realism. Cases like this often languished unsolved, overshadowed by more urgent investigations. Nick's stomach knotted at the notion that whoever died might remain unnamed indefinitely. Fair swirl of guilt surfaced. If only someone had heeded strange smells or checked on the property earlier. Lilo picked that day to bark persistently, forcing Nick's hand. Without her, the remains might have rotted unseen for who knew how many years. "Does that mean you might never solve it?" he asked. Rosales exhaled. "Possibly. We'll try, but resources are limited." She eyed Lilo, offering a faint smile. "We owe your dog for shining light on this. The least we can do is make sure the victim's not forgotten." Nick crouched, petting Lilo's ears, murmuring thanks again. The officer leaned closer. "If you're here for closure, I'm not sure we have that, but you can place a memorial if you want." "Just keep outside the tape," Nick nodded. Reaching into his backpack, he pulled out a small bouquet he'd brought, simple wildflowers from the local shop. Clutching them, he walked to the edge of the fence, gently tucking them into a gap in the weathered wood. Lilo sniffed them, as if approving, then sat obediently. He stood a moment, letting the hush of the midday sun settle. The house, battered and silent, felt less forbidding than before, yet still heavy with sorrow. Nick closed his eyes, whispering a quiet apology to the unknown person lost inside. Detective Rosales watched, arms crossed but expression soft. Then, with a nod, Nick turned away, Lilo following. As he passed the officer by the patrol car, the man gave a curt salute, perhaps acknowledging the empathy behind Nick's actions. Walking home, Nick found himself in a reflective haze. People died alone every day, but seeing physical evidence of that isolation in such a decaying environment rattled him deeply. Lilo, sensing his mood, nudged his thigh. He smiled sadly, scratching her chin. "We did what we could," he whispered, hoping that was enough. Over the next week, Nick resumed his normal routines. Work, errands, walks with Lilo, but a shadow lingered. Occasionally, neighbors approached him with hushed questions. "Any news on the body? Did the cops find a name?" He'd shake his head, offering minimal details. Rumors soared. Some claimed it was a murder victim. Others insisted it was the old owner who'd overdosed. Without official confirmation, speculation reigned. Nick quietly steered clear of gossip, preferring to keep to himself. The nightmares recurred less frequently, but each time they struck, he'd awaken trembling. Lilo comfortingly nudging him with her muzzle until his breathing steadied. One evening, Nick scrolled local news sites. A small blurb appeared: skeletal remains found in abandoned house. Offering no new facts beyond what Nick already knew, Comments ranged from sensational to sympathetic. Some local journalists tried stirring up a story. Did the property's owners vanish under criminal circumstances? Nick was wary of fueling rumor. He only recounted how Lilo's barking led him to discover the remains, urging compassion for the victim. Ms. Daniels, a neighbor who once teased Nick about Lilo's loudness, now praised the dog as a hero. "Sometimes animals pick up on what we ignore," she remarked wryly. But for Nick, hero labels felt misplaced. He simply followed Lilo's insistence. The real tragedy was how easily someone could fade from memory. If no one claimed the body, the final burial might be anonymous. A quiet farewell to a stranger once rumored to have walked these very sidewalks. Late at night, with Lilo snoozing on the couch, Nick often wondered who that person was. Did they have friends, a family that once loved them? The swirling questions eventually prodded him to take one last step for closure. He decided to contact the local historical society or city archives, seeking clues about the house's past owners. Maybe, by uncovering a link, he could help the police solve the puzzle and honor the victim's name. He jotted a mental note: "Call City Archives tomorrow." Tucking Lilo's blanket over her sleeping form, he exhaled a slow breath. This journey began with insistent barking and a grim discovery, but perhaps it would end with compassion, not just for the lost soul in that house, but for a community forced to confront how easily people can vanish in plain sight. If he could ensure that the unknown victim found recognition, then maybe Lilo's efforts and his own harrowing experience would truly mean something. With that resolve, he clicked off the lamp, letting the hush of the night cradle him in fitful peace, ready to follow the trail of secrets wherever it led next. Over the following days, Nick found his thoughts consumed by the abandoned house and the nameless remains discovered there. Although Detective Rosales had said resources were limited, Nick felt that simply leaving it all to chance would be wrong. He kept recalling the moment Lilo refused to leave that porch, her frantic barking, almost as if she carried the voice of that lost soul. Determined to honor that calling, he decided to do his own quiet investigation into the property's history. If the police couldn't spare the time, maybe he could find clues that would at least give the deceased a name. On a gray Saturday morning, Nick headed downtown to the city archives. Clutching a small folder with the house's address scribbled on a notepad, he stepped into a building that smelled of old paper and dust. Rows of file cabinets lined the walls, while a few scattered computers offered digital records. The weary clerk at the reception desk glanced up, her reading glasses slipping down her nose. "Help you?" she asked, monotone but not unkind. Nick explained he wanted records on a specific property, or perhaps info about its owners from years past. The clerk raised a brow. "You mean that rundown place on Maple Drive? Heard about the body in there." She pushed a sign-in sheet forward, not needing more details. "All the property records from that area are in Section B. Good luck." "It's a mess." Nick nodded thanks, stepping toward the aisles of musty folders. He realized he had no guarantee of finding anything conclusive. Maybe the owners sold it privately, or the records were incomplete. But if there was any mention of an occupant who mysteriously vanished, it could help the authorities identify the remains. For an hour or more, he flipped through dusty ledgers, scanned archaic microfilm pages, and squinted at outdated real estate listings. He discovered references to a family named Hillcrest. Apparently, the last official owners before the city marked the house as abandoned for unpaid taxes. The father's name was Leonard, the mother's name Sylvia, and they supposedly had no children. The last recorded date for property taxes was nearly 7 years ago. After that, there was a vague notice of foreclosure that never fully completed, a legal limbo. Nick frowned, heart quickening as he studied the timeline. If the remains were from 7 years ago, it matched the gap. Could it be Leonard or Sylvia lying in that dark corner? Encouraged, he copied everything onto his phone camera. Lilo waited patiently at the building's entrance. Pets weren't allowed inside. Occasionally, he peeked out to check she was calm. Once satisfied, he skimmed more microfilm, unearthing a small local newspaper snippet: "Hillcrest couple leaves town amid financial troubles." The article, short on details, merely stated that neighbors noticed their sudden absence. Some speculated they'd relocated to another state. No official follow-up existed, The puzzle deepened. If they truly left, how did a corpse end up in their house? Either one spouse never left at all, or someone else was squatting. Unanswered questions loomed. Loaded with notes, Nick returned to Lilo, who greeted him with a wag and a slight whine, as if sensing his disquiet. "At least we have names," he murmured to her. "Leonard and Sylvia Hillcrest, but which one was in that corner? Or was it someone else entirely?" Lilo tilted her head, silent but attentive. Nick sighed, deciding to share these findings with Detective Rosales. Maybe it could prompt cross-checking with missing persons data. He tried calling her, but it went to voicemail. Undeterred, he left a detailed message. Throughout the afternoon, he mulled the possibility that either Leonard or Sylvia died in that house, unreported. The notion chilled him. The other spouse never told anyone, or couldn't. Did they vanish because of guilt or fear? Or was it a stranger squatting, dying alone? The swirl of speculation felt heavy. By evening, he resolved to drive past the house again, out of a persistent urge to see if anything changed. Lilo hopped into the passenger seat, tail wagging gently. The house looked the same, police tape still strung around, the door sealed with a plywood board. The patrol car was gone, indicating the major forensic work had ended. Nick parked across the street, peering at the dark windows. Lilo let out a low growl. Ears perked. Nick gently hushed her. "It's okay, girl. We won't go inside," he whispered, heart pounding with memories. While he stood there, a neighbor approached, a middle-aged woman clutching a grocery bag. She recognized Lilo, nodding grimly. "You found the poor soul, right?" Nick nodded, explaining he was trying to figure out if it might be Leonard or Sylvia Hillcrest. The woman sighed, saying she vaguely remembered the couple, quiet, kept to themselves, some money issues. Then she hesitated, glancing at the boarded door. Rumor was that Sylvia left Leonard or something. People gossiped she ran off, and he was too ashamed to face foreclosure. But no one's sure. That did little to clarify the matter. Nick thanked her anyway, feeling the weight of rumor overshadow facts. Back home, Nick discovered a voicemail from Detective Rosales. She sounded mildly intrigued by the Hillcrest lead, saying forensics was trying to match any prints or dental records, but no hits yet. She admitted a possible scenario, if one spouse died inside and the other left in panic. Rosales encouraged Nick to let the department handle deeper investigative steps. He sighed at the phone, part relieved, part restless. Lilo stood nearby, wagging her tail as though hoping for a resolution. As the night wore on, Nick brooded over the heartbreak of that house. Even if the remains belonged to a Hillcrest, the tragedy remained the same. A life ended, unnoticed by neighbors or friends. In the hush, he replayed the moment Lilo barked incessantly at the porch, a dog's raw instinct cutting through apathy. Without that push, the occupant's memory would have stayed buried behind rotting walls. Now, at least, there was some chance of naming the lost. Nick patted Lilo's head, whispering, "We're close, girl. Maybe soon we'll know for sure." Lilo wagged her tail in the dim kitchen light, a silent promise to stand by his side for the final unraveling of the abandoned house's secret. Days rolled by, leaving Nick in a limbo of half-answers. Every so often, Detective Rosales texted brief updates. The remains were confirmed as an adult female, consistent with the approximate height of Sylvia Hillcrest. However, no definitive proof pinned it to her yet. Dental records were incomplete, and no living relatives stepped forward. Nick felt a gnawing ache each time he thought of that lost woman, discovered only because of Lilo's insistent barking. One afternoon, Nick decided to drive out to the old Hillcrest estate, where they supposedly lived before the move to that ill-fated house. He doubted anyone remained, but something tugged him to see if neighbors there recalled the couple's final days. Lilo hopped in the passenger seat, as always, ready for an outing. As they cruised through winding suburban lanes, Nick questioned whether he was overstepping. The police had a handle on the case. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Lilo had led him on a path requiring follow-through. He arrived at a small cul-de-sac, lined with large but modest houses, nothing extravagant, just neat lawns and trimmed hedges. The street sign read Hillcrest Lane, ironically, though presumably it wasn't named after Sylvia or Leonard, but an older lineage. Nick parked and approached a woman gardening by a mailbox. Lilo watched with perked ears as Nick introduced himself, explaining he was investigating the Hillcrest family who once lived around here. The woman, initially cautious, admitted she vaguely remembered a couple named Leonard and Sylvia who'd relocated a few years back. "Didn't know them well," she said, eyeing Lilo warily. "I think they were under financial strain. They left abruptly. That's all I know." Nick thanked her, continuing down the lane. Another neighbor, an older man tending roses, offered a bit more. He recalled Leonard losing a job, tension in the household, then a for sale sign that vanished without explanation. "One day they were just gone," he shrugged. Nick pressed gently, asking if there was any rumor that Sylvia might have stayed behind or come to harm. The man shook his head, perplexed. Lilo sniffed the grass near the curb, uninterested in the conversation. Leaving Hillcrest Lane, Nick felt the same emptiness, no leads, no closure. Just a whisper that Sylvia vanished under suspicious circumstances. He tried the city archives again, searching for any sign of a divorce filing or missing persons report, but came up empty. Meanwhile, local gossip about the mummified remains cooled off, overshadowed by fresher news. Nick realized the tragic discovery might fade back into obscurity unless forensics matched a record soon. The prospect that Sylvia's fate would remain a mystery unsettled him deeply. Through it all, Lilo stayed at his side, a quiet beacon of comfort. Nights where nightmares returned, Nick would wake to find Lilo perched on the bed's edge, watching him with concerned eyes. He'd stroke her head, recalling the day she refused to ignore that haunted porch. If only more humans shared such unwavering compassion, maybe tragedies like this wouldn't linger in shadows. Then one Friday evening, Nick's phone chimed with Detective Rosales' number. Her tone carried mild excitement. "We got a partial match on dental records from an old clinic database. It points strongly to Sylvia Hillcrest. I can't confirm 100%, but it's a big step." A weight lifted from Nick's chest. "So it was her," he murmured, half expecting the answer. Rosales sighed. "Likely, yes. We suspect cause of death might have been an untreated health crisis, heart failure, or some infection. Hard to say. No overt sign of assault, but the environment was too deteriorated for certain. We're labeling it suspicious but unproven foul play." Nick slumped onto his couch, Lilo by his feet. "At least we have a name," he said, voice trembling slightly. "She doesn't remain unidentified," Rosales agreed, explaining they'd keep the investigation open, though leads were scarce. Leonard's whereabouts remained unknown. "He might have left or passed elsewhere," she said. "But from our standpoint, you and your dog helped ensure Sylvia won't just be another John or Jane Doe. She'll get a proper record, maybe a rightful burial." After the call, Nick felt an odd mixture of relief and sorrow. He gazed at Lilo, who wagged her tail lightly, as though sensing the quiet victory. "You did it, girl," he said, patting her head. "We know who she was now." The dog leaned in, tail swishing. Nick realized that acknowledging Sylvia's identity might be the last puzzle piece of this haunting saga. Still, grief lingered for a woman who died alone, undiscovered for so long. A few days later, Detective Rosales reached out again, stating that city workers planned to board up the house permanently or demolish it. Neighbors demanded it be cleared, not wanting a grim reminder in their community. Rosales hinted at a small possibility of a county service burying Sylvia's remains, absent any found relatives. Nick felt compelled to attend any short memorial or gathering, no matter how modest. This unknown neighbor, once rumored to have left the city, at least deserved someone to stand witness. He showed up on a gray morning, Lilo at his side, outside a modest funeral home used by the county for indigent burials. A handful of officials were present, including Rosales, a county clerk, and a chaplain who offered a simple prayer. The casket was small, a sign of how little remained, and there were no flowers except a single bouquet Nick brought, white lilies, signifying a hope for peace. Lilo sat quietly, tail unmoving, as if sensing the solemnity. No tears fell from bystanders. Most didn't even know Sylvia personally, but Nick felt tears prick his eyes, thinking of how cheaply a life can vanish if no one's there to mourn. After a brief word from the chaplain, The casket was sealed for burial. Nick placed his lilies on top, whispering a soft goodbye. Lilo sniffed the air, ears twitching. To Nick's surprise, Rosales gently patted Lilo's head, murmuring thanks to them both for unraveling the mystery. "Without your dog, we might never have known," she said. Nick nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. The emptiness of this final farewell weighed heavily. Sylvia's story ended here, with no family to claim her remains, just a few strangers honoring her memory. They parted ways, leaving Nick and Lilo by the funeral home's curb. He ruffled Lilo's ears, a bittersweet smile curling his lips. "All done, girl. We gave her a name and a proper goodbye." Lilo wagged her tail, pressing close. Nick exhaled, relieved yet deeply moved by the entire ordeal. Though Sylvia's fate remained partly mysterious, had she died of neglect, illness, heartbreak, one certainty burned bright. A dog's loyal bark had summoned the living to bear witness to her passing, to ensure she wouldn't lie forever in that lonely tomb of decaying walls. After the somber farewell for Sylvia Hillcrest, a calm finally settled into Nick's daily life. With the body identified and a minimal ceremony held, he half expected the weight of it all to lift. Yet a persistent unease lingered. Each time he passed the abandoned house, now boarded up for imminent demolition, Lilo would perk her ears, letting out a brief, subdued whine, as if still sensing unfinished business. Though Detective Rosales hinted the case might remain partially unsolved, Nick found it difficult to move on, gnawed by one question. Where was Leonard Hillcrest? He tried to shake the feeling that something else was amiss. Perhaps Leonard died elsewhere, or left the city. But part of him kept replaying the rumors about the couple's abrupt departure. If Sylvia never left that house, had Leonard truly vanished by choice, or was there a deeper, darker secret never revealed? On a restless evening, Nick confided in Ms. Daniels, the neighbor turned ally. Over tea, he admitted, "I can't let go of the idea that Leonard might still be out there, or that he had a hand in what happened." Ms. Daniels, equally curious, suggested they do a final comb through city records for any trace of Leonard's name. Detective Rosales was stretched thin, and this might be all they could do before the house's demolition erased further clues. So one Sunday morning, Ms. Daniels accompanied Nick to the archives. Lilo wasn't allowed inside, so Nick left her with a friend for the day. Together, they scoured every listing that might mention Leonard in local job directories, court records, or even hospital logs. Hours passed with minimal luck. No recent sightings of a Leonard Hillcrest, Mrs. Daniels discovered a faint thread, a court summons from about a decade prior, referencing debts, but no resolution followed. Late in the afternoon, they found one last item, a permit application from years ago, filed for renovations on that abandoned house. The applicant's signature looked like Lure Hillcrest, the date suspiciously close to the time the couple supposedly vanished. Mrs. Daniels frowned, pointing out how the city's final sign-off never occurred. This suggests Leonard tried to fix the house. Maybe they planned to stay there. Nick swallowed, recalling how rotted the interior was. Those renovations never happened. If he started, then disappeared. Maybe that's around when Sylvia died. But why did he vanish after? Ms. Daniels shrugged, stumped. The permit alone doesn't prove foul play, but it's a puzzle piece. After leaving the archives, they contacted Detective Rosales. She listened to their findings politely, but sounded unconvinced. "We lack evidence that Leonard murdered Sylvia or even lived there at the end. If he's alive and he's not using that name around here, a no missing persons search flagged him," she explained. "We'll keep the permit note on file, but unless we get a lead on his whereabouts, it's a dead end." Miss Daniels, disappointed, ended the call with a soft sigh. That evening, Nick returned home, unsettled. Lilo greeted him with gentle tail wags, perhaps sensing his frustration. The next morning, while on a walk, he passed the battered fence around the haunted property. Workers in neon vests had begun setting up equipment to tear it down, piling rubble in the yard. Lilo let out a distressed bark, refusing to move forward. Nick patted her, murmuring, "It's almost over, girl. They'll demolish the place soon." A construction foreman recognized Nick from rumors. asking if he wanted to see inside one last time before everything was bulldozed. Nick hesitated. Memories of that decaying corpse still burned behind his eyes, but Lilo's anxious stance made him accept. Maybe she sensed something else left behind. Slipping past the tape, Nick ventured through the half-collapsed doorway. The main room was stripped of debris, corners dusted for forensics. Shafts of morning light cut through missing roof segments. The stench had lessened, though a sour tang lingered. Lilo poked around the base of a toppled cabinet, barking once. Nick's heart pounded. What if she was fixating on another grim find? Steeling himself, he nudged the cabinet aside, discovering only rotted wood and scattered nails. He exhaled relief. Moving carefully down the hallway, he recalled that horrifying bedroom, now empty except for stained walls. The city cleanup crew must have removed the fouled mattress and any leftover detritus. Lilo sniffed the corner, letting out a brief, sharp bark again. Nick tried the closet door, warping on rusted hinges. It opened with a groan, revealing a small space with sagging shelves. No body, no hidden item, just a dusty cardboard box. Lilo sniffed it fiercely, tail wagging in agitation. Nick's pulse quickened. He lifted the box, rummaging through old photographs, water-damaged letters, and a mildewed binder. The pictures were too faded to identify faces clearly, but one letter caught his eye. The envelope read, L. Hillcrest, Project Plans. Inside, a single page detailed rough sketches for remodeling, plus scribbled notes. Need money from father's estate. Sylvia worried. Must keep location secret. If something happens... The sentence trailed off mid-thought. Nick's heart hammered. This was Leonard's writing, presumably, but if something happens implied a lurking dread. Could Sylvia's death be connected to that fear? He stuffed the letter into his pocket, thoughts racing. If Leonard penned it, maybe he anticipated trouble. But from whom? Ms. Daniels and Detective Rosales would want to see this. Lilo barked again, scratching the closet's floor. Nick crouched, shining his flashlight. The wood planks were loose, pried up around the edges. He pried one open, revealing a narrow crawl space. Horror flickered. Did another secret remain hidden? Mustered by Lilo's unyielding glare, Nick wedged the plank aside, shining light down into a shallow pit. Dust motes swirled, revealing a small metal lockbox. Heart pounding, he lifted it out. It was rusted, locked, but brittle enough to pry open. Inside, when he found more disintegrating papers, maybe legal documents or diaries. A small cluster of Polaroids, edges moldy, depicted a younger man and woman in front of a freshly painted house. The couple's smiles radiated hope. The house behind them presumably this same place when it wasn't a ruin. Nick's breath caught, imagining Leonard and Sylvia once brimming with optimism. Another photo showed them hugging a golden retriever puppy, so they had a dog. The puzzling question, why was it all hidden away? Lilo whined softly, as though urging Nick to wrap up. With trembling hands, he secured the found items. He left swiftly, heart swirling with sympathy for two people who'd tried to rebuild a life, only for it to end in tragedy. Now perhaps these scraps might shed more light on their final days, and maybe even confirm if Leonard was indeed gone or still out there. Clutching the box, Nick thanked the foreman, leaving the property with Lilo at his side, her duty once again complete. The policeman outside only nodded as Nick walked by, unaware that fresh clues lay in Nick's pocket. While a part of him dreaded uncovering more heartbreak, he also felt certain that Lilo's persistent barks had yet again guided him to a hidden truth. Whether or not justice could be served, at least their story might finally be told. Nick left the condemned house with a tightness in his chest, clutching the small lockbox and disintegrating papers. Lilo trotted beside him, ears half raised as though sensing his anxious energy. As soon as they climbed into his car, he spread the contents across the passenger seat, scanning the faded Polaroids. The couple in them, presumably Leonard and Sylvia Hillcrest, looked vibrant and hopeful, standing before what was once a freshly painted home. Hard to believe it was the same place that now lay rotting and boarded up. One photograph showed them hugging a golden retriever puppy, their smiles radiant. Yet among these glimpses of happier times were scrawled notes, half-legible diaries, and sketches for a remodel project. Most pages were water-damaged or partly eaten by mold, but from the fragments Nick pieced together a picture of financial strain and hush-hush plans. One note repeated the phrase, "Need father's estate released, Sylvia uncertain." Another mentioned anonymous threats, though Nick couldn't decipher the details. The text was too smudged, torn in places. Still, it suggested a swirl of tension overshadowing the Hillcrest's attempt to rebuild their lives. If these papers had been hidden under floorboards, it pointed to either paranoia or genuine fear. After strapping Lilo in, Nick carefully bagged the soggy papers, deciding at once to bring them to Detective Rosales. If the woman in that bedroom was Sylvia, and Leonard truly feared outside threats, maybe something in these notes revealed an enemy or pressure that forced them into secrecy. Lilo peered at him from the back seat, her head tilted, as if to say, "Let's finish this." He nodded grimly. "Yes, let's see if this unlocks any truth." Within an hour, Nick stood at the police station's front desk, requesting to speak with Detective Rosales. Lilo waited in the lobby, tail wagging at passers-by. Eventually, Rosales arrived, eyebrows rising when Nick revealed the battered lockbox. "Found these under a floorboard," he explained quietly. Her eyes flicked with new interest. She beckoned him to a small side office, accepting the box, rummaging through the mildewed documents. "Huh," she murmured. "We never caught that. Good thing your dog fixated on it." Nick exhaled relief. Another testament to Lilo's instincts, he thought. Rosales made copies of each page, quickly scanning for anything referencing violence. Some lines hinted at ominous phone calls or demands for money, but no direct mention of who threatened them. The detective frowned. "We'll check bank records or father's estate claims to see if there was a lawsuit or blackmail." Good find, though. Could shift this from accidental death to potential foul play. Nick swallowed. The thought of Sylvia's final moments overshadowed by fear made his stomach twist. He asked if this would help find Leonard. Rosales shrugged. "If he's alive, maybe. The father's estate angle might point us to family lawyers or executors. We'll see what can be traced." She assured Nick they'd intensify the search, though years had passed since the Hillcrests vanished. Nick left the station with a flicker of hope that the Hillcrest tragedy might be solved. Lilo, trotting at his side, caught the attention of a few officers who recognized her from earlier mentions. One joked, "That dog's a better detective than half our squad." Nick offered a faint grin, patting Lilo's head. Indeed, everything hinged on her unwavering sense that something more lay hidden within those walls. Days passed with no immediate breakthrough. Nick tried to occupy his mind with daily routines, taking Lilo on quiet walks in other parts of town to avoid the boarded-up house's gloom. Yet each stroll triggered memories of that decaying interior and the hush of unsolved secrets. Late at night, he'd check his phone, half expecting a call from Rosales. He found solace in the fact that at least Sylvia had a name for her burial, some closure, if incomplete. Then one afternoon, Detective Rosales rang, voice tinged with excitement. "We might have found a connection." The father's estate was tied to a complicated inheritance lawsuit. Leonard fought with an uncle over rightful claims. The uncle, a man named Gerald Hillcrest, threatened to block any payouts unless certain debts were resolved. Nick frowned, recalling the scribbled notes about threats. "So maybe Gerald pressured them?" he asked. Rosales sighed. "Could be. We're trying to track Gerald down, but he's not local. Moved states a while back." She admitted that it was still circumstantial, no smoking gun, but it offered a plausible reason Leonard or Sylvia might have hidden or faced intimidation. When Nick hung up, he noticed Lilo at his feet, tail giving a single wag as though encouraging him not to lose hope. For the next week, Rosales's updates trickled in. Gerald Hillcrest's whereabouts were uncertain, leading the detective to suspect the entire family dispute had gone off record. Nick found himself wishing he could do more. The policeman outside that house mentioned it'd be demolished soon. Once that happened, no further clues would remain. Yet Lilo's insistent presence throughout gave him confidence that if there was a path to truth, they'd find it. The demolition date finally arrived. Early morning, trucks and heavy machinery converged, guarded by a small perimeter. Neighbors watched with a mix of relief and unease. Nick, drawn by a sense of finality, drove by with Lilo. They stood across the street, witnessing the excavator claw at the roof. Boards splintered, dust clouds billowed. Nick's heart thumped at the memory of discovering that body. Lilo let out a low whine as the old structure's remains collapsed in a thunderous crash. With that, the Hillcrest house was no more than rubble. A blank slate for a developer's new plan, the site's dark story buried beneath fresh concrete. Nick exhaled a shaky breath, patting Lilo's side. "We did all we could, girl." She gazed up, tail gently wagging. Maybe some ghosts were at rest now, Sylvia's final secret out in the open. But the question of Leonard's fate remained. Rosalis's last text said she'd keep the case open if new leads emerged. Nick sighed, guiding Lilo back to the car. He suspected closure wouldn't come easily. Yet a sense of calm found him, knowing at least the victim wouldn't remain unknown. That lonely hush inside that broken house was replaced by knowledge. Someone cared enough to identify and bury her. As they drove away, Nick felt Lilo's head on his shoulder, a quiet reassurance that sometimes a single dog's bark can unearth truths meant to be found. He reflected on how that short bark had brought him from everyday walks to confronting a tragedy no one else dared approach. The memory of stepping into darkness lingered, but overshadowed now by the belief that if they hadn't intervened, Sylvia might never have been found. If Leonard was out there, hopefully justice or resolution would come. Meanwhile, Nick and Lilo carried forward, sure that compassion and curiosity, especially from a determined dog, held the in the weeks following the house's demolition, the neighborhood settled back into its everyday hush. The fenced lot sat empty, marked only by a sign promising new development coming soon. Occasionally, Nick drove past with Lilo, reflecting on how just months ago that lot concealed tragic secrets. Now it lay flattened, the final ghost of the Hillcrests wiped from the landscape. Yet Nick's mind couldn't fully let it rest. Detective Rosales had no conclusive leads on Leonard Hillcrest's fate, and the distant relative, Gerald, remained elusive. The sense of an unfinished story lingered. One crisp morning, Nick took Lilo on a longer route, strolling near the local market. He'd begun to integrate normalcy again, confident that they'd done all they could for Sylvia's memory. Lilo, playful as ever, sniffed at store entrances, tail wagging whenever passers-by offered a friendly pat. Nick admitted to himself that he found renewed appreciation for life's small pleasures. Hot coffee, a wagging dog's greeting, the knowledge that sometimes stepping into darkness can yield light. He was ready to move forward, letting time handle the rest. Then, as they passed a thrift store, Lilo abruptly stopped, ears snapping upright. Nick glanced around, noticing a man rummaging through a donation bin. Nothing about him seemed unusual at first, just a scruffy figure in an old coat. Yet Lilo let out a muted bark, her posture stiffening as though recognizing something. Nick watched, curiosity prickling his nerves. Lilo's memory had proven uncanny before. Why bark at this random stranger? He gave the leash a gentle tug. "Come on, girl, let's not harass passers-by." But Lilo refused to budge, letting out another bark, sharper this time. The man turned, revealing a face etched with fatigue, stubble marking an unshaved chin. His eyes flicked to Nick, then to Lilo. For a moment, confusion danced across his expression. Then he hastily shoved the items back in the bin and stepped away, limping slightly. Nick's heartbeat quickened. Was Lilo reacting to some faint scent of the Hillcrest house? That seemed far-fetched. But in this strange saga, he'd learned to trust her signals. He decided to take a chance. "Excuse me," he called, approaching cautiously. The man froze mid-limp, shoulders tense. Up close, Nick noticed a faint scar along the man's temple, hair thinning. Lilo whined, tail uncertain. "Sorry if we startled you," Nick offered. "My dog's a bit sensitive. She recognized something about you, maybe." The man stared, eyes flicking from Lilo to Nick. "I don't know your dog," he muttered, voice trembling. Nick nodded politely, stepping back a bit, not wanting to spook him. "Apologies, didn't mean to bother you." As Nick turned to lead Lilo away, the man let out a shaky sigh. "Wait," he rubbed his temple as though fighting a headache. "Are your dogs from that old place, the one they tore down?" Nick's breath caught. How would he know that? He nodded slowly, dread prickling along his spine. "We found someone in there," he said carefully. The man swallowed, eyes haunted. "Sylvia?" The single name, a near whisper, sent Nick's heart pounding. He swallowed. "You knew her?" The man's face contorted with grief and shame. I might be Leonard, or used to be," he said, voice cracking. "I heard about a body discovered, but I couldn't face it. Then the house got demolished." He stared at Lilo as though the dog bore the blame. "Why'd your dog dig up the past? I wanted to forget. Vanish." Nick gaped, uncertain how to respond. If this was truly Leonard Hillcrest, they'd found the man who disappeared. But the bitterness in his tone suggested deep wounds. Lilo let out a low whine, as though sensing the raw pain. Finding words, Nick gently said, "Sylvia is identified. The police suspect she died years ago. We never knew how or why." Leonard trembled, tears brimming in his eyes. He slumped against the thrift store wall, face drawn with sorrow. "I never wanted that. She got sick. We had no money. She refused to see a doctor. When I found her body," his voice cracked, choking on a sob, "I panicked. I left, planning to come back with help. But then, I couldn't face it. I thought if I vanished, no one would know my failure." Nick's throat tightened. Lilo pressed forward, sniffing the man's leg as if recognizing some fleeting scent from the remnants in the house. Possibly he'd been inside around the same time, leaving traces. The man, Leonard, presumably, gently patted Lilo's head, tears streaking his cheeks. "I was a coward," he whispered. "I let her rot there. I was too ashamed. I couldn't pay for a funeral. So I drifted, living day to day, burying the guilt." The confession battered Nick's senses with conflicting emotions. Heartbreak that Sylvia died alone, slight relief that it wasn't cold-blooded murder, and anger at Leonard for abandoning her body. Yet seeing him in ragged clothes, trembling with remorse, Nick softened. "It's done," he said quietly. "She's at peace now. The police gave her an indigent burial. I placed flowers. But you should talk to Detective Rosales. Explain your side." Leonard sniffed, shaking his head. "They'll arrest me, or scorn me for letting her body decay." Nick sighed, understanding that fear, but also realizing the law might show leniency if no foul play was proven. "Better than running forever," he insisted. "Your wife deserves closure, too." The man's tears fell anew at the word wife. Lilo whined, resting her chin on Leonard's worn shoe. Perhaps no words could fully absolve the guilt, but acknowledging the truth was a start. Eventually, Leonard nodded, voice a husky murmur. Will you come with me? I can't do this alone." Nick hesitated, then placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder. "Yes," he answered simply. "We'll go together." "No more hiding." Lilo wagged her tail gently, as if approving the decision to finally bring the story full circle. That day, Nick phoned Detective Rosales, who listened in stunned silence as he explained that Leonard might have surfaced. The detective asked them to meet at the station. No immediate talk of arrest, just facts to confirm. Nick and Lilo guided Leonard into the car, the man's breath shaking like a leaf in a storm. In that short drive, an unspoken hush settled. Lilo perched in the back seat, head on Leonard's lap, offering comfort in a quiet, canine way. And Nick, eyes on the road, realized how improbable everything was. A dog's bark unearthing Sylvia's remains, then an unplanned encounter revealing Leonard's fate. Sometimes, reality felt more orchestrated than any fiction. Nick drove in tense silence, Leonard slumped in the passenger seat, and Lilo perched on the back seat with her muzzle resting on the ragged man's shoulder. Any passing glance at them would have revealed a strange trio. One lost dog that spurred this entire saga, the weary homeowner presumed dead or vanished, and the ordinary man who'd stumbled onto their tragedy. Yet each breath now carried the weight of a decade's secrets coming to light. Nick recalled how Lilo's bark had first led him to Sylvia's remains, how he'd spent countless days puzzled by her lonely death. Now, in a stroke of fate, he was guiding Leonard toward the police station, possibly to face accountability. They pulled up to the station's modest facade. Detective Rosales stood outside, arms folded, scanning the street. Upon spotting the car, she approached, her eyes flicking from Nick to the disheveled figure trembling beside him. Leonard avoided her gaze, half hidden by the doorframe. Nick gently nudged him. "She's here to help, not harm," he whispered. Lilo let out a low whine, encouraging him. Finally, Leonard mustered enough courage to step out of the car, wincing at the bright midday sun. Rosales greeted them carefully, voice neutral but not unkind. "So, you're Leonard Hillcrest?" He nodded faintly. She gestured inside. "We'll talk in a private room. Nothing formal yet, I just need your account." Leonard cast a haunted look at Nick, who gave a reassuring nod. "It's all right," Nick murmured. "I'll wait here with Lilo if that's better." Leonard swallowed, voice raspy. "Please. I don't want you to see me fall apart." Nick accepted, patting Lilo's head as Rosales gently led Leonard inside. Time stretched in the small station lobby. Nick found a bench by the window, Lilo resting at his feet. Each tick of the wall clock intensified Nick's nerves. What if Leonard's explanation revealed something darker, a hidden crime? Or if Leonard disappeared again, undone by guilt? At least now there was a chance for truth, a chance to close Sylvia's chapter with clarity. A subdued hush fell over the station corridors, officers passing occasionally with polite nods. Eventually, Miss Daniels arrived, having caught wind from Rosales that Leonard surfaced. She sank onto the bench next to Nick, exhaling in relief. "We never expected him to just show up like this," she said softly. "Seems like Lilo's instincts triggered a chain reaction. Without her, he'd still be in hiding, right?" Nick gently stroked Lilo's ear, nodding. "She's the reason any of this got resolved, or at least is getting resolved. I just followed her lead." The dog whined contentedly, as though acknowledging their praise. After nearly an hour, Rosales re-emerged, motioning Nick to a side office. Ms. Daniels followed. Inside, Leonard sat at a small table, eyes red but posture calmer. Rosales explained that he'd given a statement, how he and Sylvia tried to save money to fix up the property, how financial troubles and pressure from extended family spiked their stress. When Sylvia fell gravely ill, they lacked medical insurance. Leonard panicked, believing he could secure emergency funds by traveling out of state, but found none. By the time he returned, she had died. Terrified of legal consequences and ashamed of failing her, he fled again, leaving Sylvia's body undiscovered. Over the years, he drifted, occasionally returning at night to that house's porch, but never daring to go in. Leonard let out a shaky breath, glancing at Nick. "I saw your dog once at the fence," he confessed. "Recognized the bark echo in that empty place, but I ran away. I felt sure it meant the house's ghost was calling me. Then I left for the city outskirts, hoping no one would ever link me to it." "Ms." Daniels inhaled sharply, sympathy etched across her face. Rosales, arms crossed, remained impartial, though her eyes softened. "We don't see evidence of murder. This looks like severe negligence, but the statute of limitations might complicate charges. We'll investigate further, but for now you're not under formal arrest. You do need to cooperate fully. There may be a hearing." Leonard nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I'll face it," he rasped, voice heavy with remorse. "She deserved better." A trembling hush fell. Nick stooped to pet Lilo, who leaned forward, pressing her nose to Leonard's pant leg. The man offered a watery smile, patting Lilo's head as though thanking her. "You found her. You gave her a name again." Rosales cleared her throat, breaking the moment's heaviness. "I'd like you to sign your statement, Mr. Hillcrest. Then we can discuss next steps like verifying your identity." Leonard complied, pen shaking in his grip. Nick lingered near the doorway, feeling the final puzzle piece click into place. Sylvia's story, though tragic, had an end. A name, a reason for her lonely fate. He only wished Lilo's bark could have intervened years earlier. An hour later, they stepped outside. Rosales told Leonard to stay in town, offering contact info for shelters or social services. Ms. Daniels chimed in with local resources. Leonard, looking frail but more at peace, thanked them all. He turned to Nick, tears brimming once more. "If there's any kindness left in this world, it's because of folks like you and that dog." Nick swallowed, speechless. Lilo wagged her tail, her unspoken language bridging the sorrow. They parted ways, Leonard stepping into a borrowed coat Miss Daniels provided, walking down the street with a promise to keep in touch for any legal follow-up. Nick and Ms. Daniels watched him go, Lilo letting out a small, hopeful yip. The detective came out to see them off, reiterating that while the case might not see a major trial, at least the official records would reflect the truth. Sylvia died of untreated illness, abandoned by a terrified husband who'd now admitted his guilt. If no new details emerged about wrongdoing from the Hillcrest relatives, the matter might conclude quietly. Nick drove home in a subdued state, Lilo pressing her muzzle against his arm. "It's done, girl," he murmured, turning onto the familiar street. His heart still weighed heavy with the tragedy of it all, but overshadowed by relief that Sylvia's memory wasn't lost to time. Lilo's bark had forced the world to notice, forced Leonard to confront his past. Nick realized sometimes the darkest secrets can only be uprooted by raw, insistent truth, like a dog's bark echoing in a silent house. As they parked, evening shadows stretched across the driveway. Nick slipped out, letting Lilo bound ahead. In the hush of dusk, he felt gratitude that Lilo's unwavering senses shaped a final resolution, however painful it might be. Tomorrow, life would continue. Neighbors might still speak of the Hillcrest tragedy, or perhaps forget soon. But Nick, glancing at Lilo's bright eyes, believed he'd always remember the day her barking exposed a secret no one else dared to unravel. A single, loyal bark that guided them all from ignorance into fragile understanding. A few weeks drifted by after Leonard's confession at the station, and life in Nick's neighborhood returned to a semblance of normalcy. The empty lot where the Hillcrest house once stood remained fenced off, awaiting new construction. Occasionally, Nick would pass by with Lilo during their walks, pausing at the chain-link barrier. Though the tragic saga had reached a kind of resolution, a faint hush lingered in the air, as though acknowledging the scars left behind. Lilo seemed calmer now, no longer barking at the vacant land. Perhaps she felt her mission was done. In the days after Leonard revealed the truth, Detective Rosales kept Nick updated on the legal side. There was no evidence of homicide, just a man who panicked and fled when his wife died in dire circumstances. Negligence was considered, but the statute of limitations and Leonard's threadbare existence made a high-profile trial unlikely. Instead, the district attorney leaned toward minimal charges, if any. Leonard cooperated, signing statements confirming he'd return if they needed him to finalize the records. In the end, the system seemed content to file the case as a tragic story of poverty and fear, with no malicious intent proven. Nick found himself divided over that outcome. Part of him understood. What good would prison do a man already haunted by guilt and living on the fringes? Another part still ached for Sylvia, who died alone in a damp bedroom, yet anger at Leonard's abandonment flickered sometimes, overshadowed by a reluctant empathy. He relayed these mixed feelings to Mrs. Daniels over coffee one afternoon. She offered a soft shrug. "It's never a clean ending in tragedies like this," she said. "We have to accept the closure we get." Lilo, snoozing at Nick's feet, let out a gentle sigh, perhaps echoing that sentiment. Meanwhile, rumors in the neighborhood died down. Some folks approached Nick, praising him and Lilo for shining a spotlight on the hidden body. Others avoided the topic, preferring to bury the memory of a dreadful discovery in their suburban midst. Only a few truly asked deeper questions. How do we as neighbors let someone vanish for so long? Nick had no easy answers, other than realizing apathy can build walls around even the busiest communities, and it sometimes takes a dog's bark to tear them down. Leonard himself drifted in and out of Nick's orbit. For a few days after his confession, he attempted to stay near the police station, uncertain if they'd hold him. Once it was clear they wouldn't, he roamed the city's outskirts, feeling out job prospects. Nick spotted him once at the grocery store parking lot, rummaging for cheap meals. They exchanged a brief, awkward greeting. Leonard thanked him again for guiding him toward a measure of honesty. Then he slipped away, not wanting to impose on Nick's kindness. Nick, torn, offered a ride or meal, but Leonard declined, eyes averted. "I need to live with my guilt," he said quietly. "Figure out if I can ever forgive myself." Nick only managed a sad nod, respecting the man's decision to keep distance. Though the city churned forward, Nick occasionally caught glimpses of local news blurbs referencing "Hillcrest tragedy concluded" or "No charges expected." People flipped to other headlines quickly, losing interest. For Nick, though, the emotional echoes didn't vanish so easily. Lilo's unwavering bark still rang in his memory, a reminder that he too had once been the kind of person who might walk by an abandoned house and assume it was just a worthless relic. He felt changed, more aware of how easily a life can slip through society's cracks when no one is looking. One evening, Nick visited the small memorial site in the New City Cemetery where Sylvia's remains had been quietly reburied under a modest marker. He brought fresh flowers, placing them on the unassuming grave. Lilo sniffed around, tail low, as though respecting the hush of the space. "We found you," he murmured, half to himself, half to Sylvia's memory. "You're not forgotten, no matter what happened." The finality of those words brought a tender ache to his chest. Lilo pressed her nose to his hand, as if sensing his melancholy, and he gently stroked her fur. Afterward, they strolled the cemetery's winding paths, reflecting on the improbable chain of events. He marveled that a routine dog walk could unravel a years-old disappearance, once whispered of as a haunted rumor. Lilo's loyalty and sharp intuition had bridged the gap between the living and the dead, compelling Nick to step inside that cursed house. Though the outcome was fraught with sorrow, at least Sylvia wasn't relegated to an anonymous grave. Nick whispered thanks to Lilo, who responded with a brief, gentle bark as if accepting the gratitude. In the following weeks, Nick settled back into his job, resuming a quieter life. Each evening, Lilo greeted him at the door, reminding him that loyalty often appears in unexpected moments. If not for her determination, would he have walked away from that suspicious porch, leaving a lonely secret to remain hidden forever? He tried not to dwell on such dark possibilities. Instead, he found new ways to channel Lilo's vigilance, volunteering at a local shelter, walking strays who needed exercise and might sense details humans overlook. He felt the memory of discovering Sylvia, fueling a fresh desire to never ignore an animal's warning or a neglected person's plight. Sometimes, on breezy nights, Nick and Lilo took a detour near the vacant lot. Nothing remained but a sign that read, "Future Home Site, Maple Residences." In time, families might build fresh memories on that patch of land, never knowing the sorrow it once contained. Nick would stand at the fence, Lilo sniffing the grass, both quiet. He didn't crave attention for what they'd done. He just wanted to hold a small vigil in his heart for Sylvia, and maybe offer a silent thanks that her story wouldn't remain invisible. As the weeks became months, the sense of finality solidified. Detective Rosales texted a final note. Closed the file on Hillcrest. Official cause, untreated illness, body discovered by concerned citizen. Leonard not indicted, though he remains a person of interest if new evidence arises. Thank you for your help, and your dog's bark. Nick read that message alone in his living room. Lilo sprawled on the couch. He patted her side, voice tight with emotion. Hear that? They're done. We did it, girl. Lilo's tail drummed once, then she settled her head on Nick's knee, content. In the end, no grand justice or revelations emerged, just a quiet resolution. But for Nick, it was enough to know that one lonely woman would rest with her name remembered, not lost in a rotting tomb of silence. He leaned down, hugging Lilo close. She let out a soft huff, relaxing into his embrace. Tomorrow, they'd resume normal walks, exploring city blocks that might hold other secrets. And if Lilo ever barked like that again, Nick would heed the call. Because sometimes a dog's unwavering determination is all it takes to unravel a forgotten tragedy and remind the world that every story, no matter how grim, deserves to be heard. Although the official case on Sylvia Hillcrest had closed, Nick couldn't fully shake the memories of that nightmarish discovery. Sometimes late at night, he'd revisit the scene in his mind. The creaking floors, the suffocating darkness, the grim remains that Lilo's unrelenting bark forced him to confront. Even though the police confirmed Sylvia's identity, the bigger story behind her tragic end still lurked in Nick's thoughts. He replayed Leonard's confession, the heartbreak that led him to flee rather than give her a proper burial. Was it truly fear of legal trouble that drove him away? or a deeper shame that he failed to protect her from illness. Most evenings, he found himself taking Lilo on a winding route through the neighborhood, pausing by the chain-link fence around the empty lot. The demolition had erased any physical remnant of the Hillcrest's existence on Maple Drive, but Nick felt compelled to stand there now and then, like a silent vigil for a life lost in solitude. Lilo would sniff around the fence, occasionally letting out a subdued grunt as if acknowledging the sad chapter behind them. Then, tail swishing softly, she'd lead him back to the sidewalk, content to resume their stroll. Meanwhile, Nick occasionally heard from Detective Rosales about the final steps of the investigation. Forensics archived Sylvia's case in the unsolved or incomplete category, concluding she likely died of untreated medical conditions. Leonard's desertion, while morally troubling, didn't rise to murder or any charge that would stand up after so many years. The Uncle Gerald never surfaced, no direct link found to a crime. Ultimately, the city wrote it off as a tragedy of poverty, secrecy, and heartbreak. Still, Nick wrestled with a sense that something intangible was left undone. Though the law might be satisfied, the emotional scars lingered. He recognized that some mysteries never find neat resolutions. In subtle ways, life pressed forward for Nick. At work, colleagues teased him gently about his CSI pup, but also commended his compassion. Friends asked if he planned to adopt another dog or do volunteer searches for missing persons with Lilo's keen instincts. He half laughed at the idea, not sure if he wanted to open that door. A single discovery had already changed him more than he ever imagined. For now, he and Lilo found peace in simpler routines, sleeping in on weekends, exploring new parks, and stopping by the dog-friendly cafe that always kept treats behind the counter. Yet on a personal level, Nick felt a shift in how he viewed strangers or neglected corners of the city. He no longer rushed past individuals sleeping under awnings or turned a blind eye to suspiciously quiet neighborhoods. He'd slow down, checking if someone needed help. Sometimes Lilo tugged at the leash near certain alleys, though rarely did it lead to anything ominous. Still, Nick welcomed the heightened awareness. The memory of Sylvia left alone for years in that house reminded him how easy it is for society to neglect those on the margins, or to dismiss a place as a mere eyesore without seeing deeper pain within. In quiet moments at home, Nick found himself sifting through online forums about lost pets, missing persons, and cold cases. Initially, it was to quell lingering curiosity about the Hillcrest situation, but it blossomed into a broader interest in how small clues can break open old mysteries. He read about volunteers who comb the outskirts of cities for unmarked graves, or who cross-reference old property records to find missing individuals. Part of him considered joining such efforts. He told Lilo one evening, "We've had our brush with the darker side of life. Maybe we can do some good with it." Lilo tilted her head, tail giving a slow wag, as though she'd follow him anywhere. From time to time, Mrs. Daniels dropped by, or they'd meet for coffee, reflecting on how everything resolved. She expressed relief that at least Sylvia had a name and a burial, yet she too carried an unspoken sorrow that this was all that was possible. "I guess we do what we can," she said softly, patting Lilo's side. "I just hope the next time a lonely house sits empty, someone checks earlier." Nick silently agreed. Leonard contacted Nick only once more. The call came from a borrowed phone, late on a drizzly afternoon. His voice trembled with residual guilt, but also a hint of resolve. He reported that he'd found a low-wage job on the city's outskirts, enough to rent a small room in a rundown motel month to month. He apologized again for the burden he caused, for letting Sylvia's remains lie there so long. Nick, swallowing his conflicted feelings, urged Leonard to forgive himself gradually. "You've done what you can to help the police. You're facing it now." Leonard sniffed, a tearful hush on the line. Then a quiet, "Thanks, and thank your dog too. She's the real hero." The call ended, leaving Nick with a soft pang of empathy. As the final weeks of summer rolled in, the lot on Maple Drive saw new activity. Developers posted sketches of a planned duplex. Some neighbors cheered the renewal, while a few whispered about the haunted property, uncertain if ghosts might linger under fresh foundations. Nick, strolling with Lilo one evening, paused at the sign. He noticed how the developer's rendering depicted cheerful families and bright lawns. With a faint smile, He patted Lilo's head. "At least something new grows from tragedy," he remarked. The dog sat quietly, tail curling around her paws. Their walk continued under a sky painted with pastel clouds. Nick's mind felt lighter than it had in weeks, as though the final layers of tension had peeled away. Yes, a woman died in sorrow, and a man fled in shame, but also a dog's unyielding bark ensured she wasn't erased from memory. The city might soon forget the entire saga, but Nick and Lilo would carry it with them, an enduring reminder that even the faintest cry for help, if heeded, can spark compassion and justice. He murmured a quiet vow to Lilo that if they ever stumbled on another suspicious place or sign of neglect, they wouldn't hesitate. She offered a gentle wag, as if wholeheartedly agreeing. Stepping into the twilight, Nick inhaled the mild evening air, savoring the hush. Lilo trotted at his heel, occasionally glancing back at the boarded fence. Though life marched on, a small piece of Maple Drive's lonely story would live on in them. And in that acceptance, a mixture of sorrow, relief, and renewed hope, Nick realized how deeply one dog's bark had altered his perspective on the world. No matter the tragic conclusion, the lost voice in that abandoned house found witness and acknowledgement at last. And as he and Lilo walked home, the final rays of sunset bathed the street in gold, hinting that sometimes the darkest secrets yield to even the smallest rays of compassion. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows on Maple Drive as Nick rounded the corner, tugging gently on Lilo's leash. The day felt ordinary enough. He was off work, planning a routine walk around the neighborhood, but Lilo, typically a playful spirit, seemed oddly restless. She pulled at the leash, ears alert, nose aimed toward a decrepit house many locals considered haunted. Its windows were shattered, paint peeled in jagged strips, and rumor claimed no one had lived there in years. Yet for some reason, Lilo kept glancing that way, letting out short, urgent barks each time Nick tried to steer her away. He paused by the sagging fence, frowning at the house's battered porch. "Come on, girl," he muttered, giving the leash a mild tug. Usually, Lilo was easy to redirect, but she barked again, rearing up on hind legs as though trying to see inside the broken windows. A prickle of unease crawled over Nick's skin. He'd passed this abandoned property 100 times, ignoring the creepy rumors. But Lilo's alarm rattled him. Her fur bristled, eyes locked on the gaping doorway, as if summoning him to investigate. "All right," he conceded, heart thumping. "Let's see what's bugging you." As they approached, the evening light cast the house in eerie hues, flaking wood glinting with a dull sheen. The front porch steps groaned under Nick's weight, dust swirling at his feet. Lilo sniffed the air, letting out short yips. The door, barely on its hinges, hung ajar, revealing a dark interior. A dank odor crept from inside, faint yet unpleasant. Nick's pulse quickened. Something about that smell spelled trouble. He contemplated turning back, but Lilo whined, pressing forward. Her jolt of nerves made him swallow. "Okay, let's do this quickly." Inside, gloom swallowed them. Nick clicked on his phone's flashlight, sweeping its narrow beam across warped floorboards and crumbling wallpaper. Cobwebs dangled from the ceiling, stirring as they passed. With each step, the floor emitted soft creaks. Nick kept one hand on Lilo's collar, fearing she might dash into the dark. She let out a volley of sharp barks, echoing around the vacant rooms. "Shh," Nick whispered anxiously, though a part of him was glad for the noise. Better to scare off any lurking animal than to be caught unawares. A stale, suffocating odor intensified as they moved deeper. Furniture lay overturned, spines of old books scattered. In the flickering phone light, shapes seemed to shift, illusions of movement in the corners. Nick's breath went shallow. He reminded himself this was just an empty house. Wasn't it? Then Lilo's bark ratcheted up, pitched with alarm, aiming her muzzle at a closed door near the end of a narrow hallway. Each bark struck Nick's nerves. "Okay," he mumbled, inching closer. "We'll check, then we're out." The corridor's wallpaper clung in scraps, revealing discolored plaster behind. Lilo stiffened, tail low, letting out throaty barks with each step. The air grew heavier, that sickly sweet stench thickening. Nick's stomach twisted. Something definitely rotted here. Carefully, he reached for the door. It stuck, forcing him to apply more strength. It gave way with a screech, a waft of putrid air blasting him in the face. He staggered back, covering his mouth. Lilo barked frantically, pawing the threshold. Her eyes locked on the blackness within. As though sure a horror lurked inside, bile rose in Nick's throat. He steadied the flashlight, stepping forward with trembling resolve. The phone's beam cut through swirling dust, revealing the silhouettes of a bedroom in disarray. An unmade mattress slumped near the wall, toppled furniture scattered around. The odor sharpened, laced with something ominously organic. Nick inched the light around the corner of a battered dresser. That's when his heart seized. A twisted shape lay half hidden on the floor, its outline wrong for mere trash or clothing. He froze, pulse hammering. Lilo barked, nails scraping the floor. "Stay," he managed, voice shaking. The flashlight's beam trembled over the shape. Pale, brittle bone, ragged cloth, motionless limbs contorted at horrible angles. Nick's mind reeled. A body, skeletal remains cloaked in fragments of decayed skin, hair matted to a grayed skull. The sight tore a scream from his chest, echoing off the peeling walls. He lurched back, almost dropping his phone. Lilo howled, a raw, urgent cry that matched his panic. For an agonized moment, neither moved, horror paralyzing Nick. His mind reeled. Why is a corpse here? How long has it been? The stench of death became a physical force, nearly toppling him with nausea. He coughed, forcing air into his lungs. Lilo let out distressed whimpers, nuzzling his leg, but kept her gaze on the gruesome remains. Regaining a shard of composure, Nick forced himself to tear his eyes away. He turned, stumbling back into the hallway, throat raw from shock. He nearly fell as he crashed into a sagging bookshelf. Lilo pawed at him, ears flattened. Adrenaline surging, Nick fumbled for the doorknob, slamming it shut behind them. The corridor felt claustrophobic. He clutched Lilo's collar, urging her to move faster, each stride pounded with terror in his veins. They reached the living room, the front door looming like salvation. Nick burst outside, gasping lungfuls of crisp air. The dog hopped after him, letting out frantic yips. Together, they staggered onto the porch, collapsing against a railing that nearly gave way. Heart raging, Nick grabbed his phone, nearly dropping it from sweaty palms. His trembling fingers dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice did little to soothe him. "There's a bee body," he stammered, choking on the word, "in an abandoned house." "It's Malgodak, it's horrifying." He forced the address out, Lilo whining by his side. The dispatcher reassured him that officers were en route, instructing him to stay outside. Nick nodded frantically, tears springing unbidden. Lilo pressed close, offering the only comfort possible. Within minutes, sirens wailed through the neighborhood. Blue lights flashed across the dingy porch. Neighbors emerged from their homes, eyes wide, uncertain. Nick trembled, one arm around Lilo, his mind replaying the corpse's twisted form. Police taped off the property, an officer guiding Nick away, asking him to recount the discovery. Lilo stayed glued to him, each bark replaced by low whimpers. Nick's voice quivered as he explained how his dog refused to leave the porch, how he found the remains. The officers exchanged grim glances, shining flashlights into the dark interior. Nick fled. His entire body shook with shock, but amidst the horror was a flicker of gratitude for Lilo's unrelenting bark. She'd refused to ignore the stench of death. If not for her, no one would have stepped inside that rotting husk of a house, leaving that lost soul to remain forever unknown. Now, at least, the truth would see daylight. As the coroner's van rumbled up the street, Nick let out a ragged breath, tears slipping down his cheeks. Lilo leaned against him, tail softly wagging as if to say, "We did our part." And Nick, between sobs, murmured, "Thank you, girl," realizing that in one spine-chilling moment, a dog's bark had upended the silence of an abandoned house, unearthing a tragedy that no one else bothered to find. The last soft glow of summer faded into an autumn chill, and the neighborhood by Maple Drive quietly transformed. Construction crews moved onto the cleared lot, setting new foundations for modern duplexes, while the memories of the old Hillcrest house, its secrets, its hidden tragedy, receded into the background of local gossip. Some neighbors continued to repeat fragments of the story. How a dog's insistent barking led to the discovery of a forgotten body. How a lost soul named Sylvia was finally laid to rest. Yet for most, daily life pressed on, overshadowing the once haunted rumor. Only Nick, with Lilo at his side, carried forward the deeper lessons of that grim event, ensuring it wouldn't vanish entirely under new asphalt and paint. Occasionally, Detective Rosales texted him short updates or a friendly greeting, but the case had long since closed. No major charges had materialized for Leonard, the missing husband. He remained on the outskirts of town, slowly rebuilding a fragile existence. The local press printed a small follow-up piece titled "Abandoned House Tragedy Ends, No Charges Filed," and the story slipped into the city's archive of near-forgotten headlines. For Nick, that felt bittersweet. On one hand, the unveiling of Sylvia's identity offered a measure of closure. On the other, the incomplete justice, Leonard's heartbreak, Sylvia's lonely end, left echoes of sorrow. Yet in the hush of early evening walks, Nick realized that tragedy rarely ties up neatly. He too had changed. The Nick from before might have hurried past an abandoned porch, dismissing a barking dog's warnings as a mere nuisance. Now he had embraced a quieter vigilance. With Lilo's unwavering presence, he found himself pausing whenever something odd caught his eye. An unfamiliar figure hunched on a stoop, a boarded window in an otherwise tidy block, a faint sound of distress somewhere unseen. Such small acts of attention wouldn't always save the day, but Nick believed that ignoring them guaranteed no one else would. And Lilo, bounding along with watchful eyes, seemed eager to confirm. Dogs often sense what humans overlook, if only humans bothered to listen. As for Lilo, she thrived on their renewed purpose. Nick marveled at her intelligence each day, whether she guided him away from a suspicious alley or barked at a neighbor's fence to reveal a stray cat stuck in a tangle of vines. Little by little, their bond deepened, echoing the trust that led them to confront the Hillcrest mystery in the first place. Sometimes, Nick jokingly called her Detective Lilo among friends. The dog simply wagged her tail, content to be his partner on these endless city streets. Another quiet transformation stirred in Nick's heart, a yearning to help beyond just that one incident. On idle evenings, he volunteered at a local animal shelter, assisting with walks or feedings. Lilo patiently accompanied him, comforting anxious dogs who might otherwise struggle in cramped kennels. The shelter staff teased him about having super pup rescue powers, but Nick waved it off. "It's just Lilo being herself," he'd say, giving her a pat. Yet he felt a deep sense of purpose there, remembering how one dog's relentless bark had cracked open a decade-old secret. If one dog could change so much in one neighborhood, how many more might do the same if only given the chance? Despite these new routines and directions, Nick often remembered Sylvia Hillcrest, the woman discovered in that lonely bedroom. On certain afternoons, he revisited the cemetery plot where her remains were laid to rest under a simple stone. Placing a few flowers, usually sunflowers or lilies, he'd stand with Lilo offering a silent tribute. In those moments, he found he no longer questioned whether it was enough. The act of remembrance itself honored her. He whispered quiet words of apology that her life ended so tragically, and gratitude that at least her name hadn't faded into anonymity. If Leonard ever mustered the courage to visit, Nick hoped the knowledge of a simple grave might help him find some peace. Miss Daniel stayed in touch, sometimes strolling with Nick and Lilo in the evenings. They spoke less about the Hillcrests now, focusing more on daily joys, like which neighbor's garden Lilo felt compelled to inspect, or which local cafe had the best dog-friendly patio. The heavier darkness of the event had loosened, replaced by a gentle awareness that life, for all its heartbreak, could spawn unexpected compassion. As Mrs. Daniels often said, "We don't need grand gestures to make a difference, just the willingness to follow through when a need arises." Standing in the streetlight glow near the vacant lot one last time, Nick recognized a quiet acceptance. The developer's sign boasted that a new complex would bring modern comforts to families. Maybe soon, children would ride bikes where once a house decayed around a lost woman's remains. The thought no longer tormented him as much. It felt like a natural cycle. Old pains replaced by new hopes. Lilo sniffed the chain-link fence, letting out a faint huff, as if saying her final goodbye. Nick gave her head a gentle rub. "We did our part," he murmured, voice echoing softly in the mild night air. If this story of a dog's unwavering bark, leading to a grim discovery, has touched you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more real-life narratives where small acts of attention uncover hidden truths. Like and share this video if you believe in the power of compassion, even from a loyal dog, to bridge forgotten corners and neglected souls. And comment below. Have you experienced a moment where an animal's intuition guided you to help someone in need? Let's celebrate the everyday heroes, human or canine, who remind us that we're all connected and that sometimes the quietest voices hold the greatest secrets.